Hello folks, it's Tartan Composer here and welcome to part 3 of Beethoven's Secret Life, or The Secret Life of Beethoven. You know, a lot of people claim to know things about Beethoven, but it's the usual stuff. He was an angry man, he was a deaf composer, but there's so much more to the man than that. And I love delving deep, as do a lot of the biographers and critics and writers and people that knew him and stuff. This is where you find out more about the man. You have to consult various different sources to get that all-round picture. Now, it's well known that Beethoven wasn't the easiest person to get on with, but there are many reasons for that, and some of them are alluded to in medical journals, because he's been called paranoid and bipolar. He had various different chronic stomach illnesses. We'll come to them in a minute. Let's look at, was he really bipolar? What we would call manic depressive, that was the old term, where people would experience periods of mania where their mind would be rushing at 100 miles an hour. They'd be full of excitement and about whatever was going on in their mind, and they would have to get it done. And then after the mania stage had passed, they would plummet into the depths of despair and possible suicidal thoughts. And that was the depressive side, hence the name manic depression. Nowadays, the political correct term is bipolar illness, right? So anyway, let's look at Beethoven. Taking aside the fact that he had the most wretched upbringing and suffered in a dysfunctional family in the sense of his father being a rotten pig and beating the crap out of him at every hand's turn, calling him for everything and treating him abysmally, you can understand why the man had certain things inside of him, certain resentments and stuff. But it's possible that he was suffering from some kind of bipolar episodes, because it is stated that he would often fly into rages. He was very disagreeable. He could have had some kind of antisocial behavioural disorder as well in that, because now we'll have to catalogue things and pigeonhole them and say, right, he's got ADHD and he's got manic depression and he's a psychopath and he's a sociopath and he's a this, that and the other. And in those days, it's possible that Beethoven did suffer from antisocial tendencies, you know. He was very anti-authoritarian, and that's one of those, there's a name, I can't remember the term exactly, but it is something to do with antisocial behaviour, and that is very anti-authoritarian. And also, I think part of that goes back to the time when he wrote his Eroica symphony, because one of his big heroes was Napoleon Bonaparte, basically, and Bonaparte was there at the time challenging the elites, if you like, the royals and all the wealthy and the elites, because they lived off the fat of the land while the poor were starving. And Napoleon basically and his armies crushed a lot of that stuff. And then, of course, Napoleon declared himself king, and that sent Beethoven into another rage where he tried to basically scratch out the name of Napoleon on this music manuscript that he'd written for his hero, and he therefore dedicated that particular piece to the public and the freedoms of the public, the ordinary people. So let's get back to the manic episodes. We know that when he sat down at the piano, he banged and banged and banged on it. I believe that was due to his deafness, as do a million other people, because obviously if he can't hear it, he's going to have to try and do something to get to hear that. So he has to play forte or fortissimo all the time, extremely loud, to try and get those vibrations through his body that he knew what he was doing. That's the sad thing, is to see a genius like him being cut off in his hearing, basically, and he went deaf in 1816, basically, but as you know, he continued to compose fantastic pieces of music, although he couldn't hear a note, but he could hear them in his head. And that's the thing. He knew what instruments that he wanted in his different pieces of music. So that's what made the man a genius, because he was indefatigable in his fight against this horrible, horrible malaise to overtake a composer. It's like an artist having his hands chopped off, or a pianist having his hands chopped off, or a musician, whatever. You just can't do anything with it, in a sense. But let's look at his rages, because these are some of the little secrets that we don't know about. It's said that when he sat down at the piano, he was basically in his head, right? He was unconscious or not conscious of anything around him. He had the capacity for just going into his head and playing, and that's absolutely true. Also, what betrays the point that he might have been bipolar was the fact that when he wasn't in his manic stage, he was the life and when he wasn't in his depressive stage, he was the life and soul of the party. Very amiable, good guy to chat to, life and soul of the party type. But also, that was at his creative point when he was manic, and he would often dash home and dash off loads and loads of music on his piano. He wouldn't give a thought for eating. Now, I can subscribe to that, because I'm in my room at the moment surrounded by all my musical instruments here and my writing desk, and when I'm doing music, time just goes by and I'm not aware of time, because you get caught up in composition and adding instruments and working out different things, and time's irrelevant. And the next thing, you look at the clock and it's 5 o'clock, it's time for tea. So I can understand that fully, although in his case, there was much more than just being occupied. There was this manic phase, okay? His pupil was the famous Carol Czerny, who brought out various tuition books for piano students and stuff, and composition books. And he said that Beethoven was a really amiable guy. In fact, he said he was up for pranks and silly jokes and things like that. So we can see that he wasn't this grumpy old man all the time that he's made out to be. He definitely was much more than that. However, according to an author who was bipolar himself, a guy who was called Connor Bazan, he had said he reckons that, to quote him, Beethoven was many things: depressed, manic, euphoric, prolific, arrogant, unkempt. He said he rarely bathed, but then who did in those days? Financially reckless, egotistical, suicidal, self-centred, and a hypochondriac and an alcoholic. But you have to remember, this was a man that was in self-imposed exile wherever he went. He constantly argued with his landlords about different things, because can you imagine a guy that can't hear banging away on a piano all the time, unaware? And he might have went about the house banging things and stuff, because he doesn't know he's creating a racket. So the people living below him or outside him, they're going to hear all that. So a lot of the times they would complain to the landlord about him coming in and out at different hours of the wee hours of the morning and stuff, banging about the place and stuff like that. And he ended up arguing with the landlords, and instead of being reasonable, he often just packed his bags and hopped it to the next place that would take him in. So he left behind him a trail of disaster in his wake, with regards to rented accommodation. In fact, one particular accommodation, he was in a stone-walled room, and he wanted to see a view of the cathedral. There was obviously no window, so he paid a team of men to come in, knock out all the squares and make a window so that he could look out and see the cathedral. Now that's great because he paid the men and all the rest of it, but the thing is he never told the landlord. And he ended up arguing with him, of course, as well, and he left the landlord with a huge big hole in the wall behind him. That's the kind of guy Beethoven was, right? He was also very paranoid because, according to the author that I just mentioned, bipolar can make you very paranoid. Now, I don't know about that. I know what paranoia is. I know what schizophrenia is. But he reckoned that he was paranoid. And certainly from certain of the books I've been looking at and some of the other sources, it does say that he could be unkempt at times. Sometimes if you look at portraits of Beethoven, he was well dressed and well groomed. But remember, this was a man that was used to living on his own a lot, having to fend for himself. And he did have servants to make him meals and stuff like that. But being a typical man, he maybe didn't pay them to clean up after him. And the result was that his rooms where he stayed were often untidy, unkempt, smelly, dirty, lots of unwashed dishes and plates lying around the place. And of course, he had a piss pot, what we used to call a chanty pot, basically. He had a pot under his piano or under the bed, and it must have stank to high heaven because I don't think he ever emptied it. And of course, it would be full of the brown stuff and his urine. So add that to an already stinking, smelly place and you get the picture. So at times he wasn't looking after himself the way he should have. He was also, I think, another thing that contributed to his rages and his anger. We all know that drinking too much coffee can cause caffeine highs, but too much can make you really nervous and irritable. Now, it's said that he was a very irritable man, and we do know from ancient records on him that he did consume a ton of coffee. So he was probably caffeined up to the max, right, and very irritable. Another thing that happened to him, and it does happen to a lot of folk living on their own, they get lonely and they think they don't have any friends, and they take to the bottle whenever things don't go right. And Beethoven was no different from that. He was a great lover of the vino, and he would buy different bottles of wine and consume them, basically. And that wasn't good because apparently in his day, I was checking this up myself, they used to add lead to wine because wine went off very, very quickly in those days compared to the modern bottling process. Even though there was glass bottles and they were corked, it still managed to leach in, and so there was lead in the wine. And the manufacturers, according to what I had read, used to put, traces of lead in there to kind of make the bad wine taste better. Now, how that would make it taste better, I have no idea. But he probably ended up with lead poisoning in the gut. I do know that he suffered from chronic bouts of diarrhea, stomach pains and all kinds of stuff. But he was eating all the kind of wrong foods, drinking, tons of coffee, drinking far too much wine, and that added to his general demeanour and his medical problems of possible bipolar and all the rest of it. It just made for a recipe for disaster. And, it's a tribute to his indomitable spirit that he overcame all these obstacles to be able to put pen to paper and write some of the finest, if not the finest music ever written. So, I'm now moving on to part